we need to get straight into it today. We're looking at a rapidly escalating public health threat, one that is causing some really devastating neurological damage, especially in young adults.
That's right.
I'm talking about nitrous oxide-induced neurological toxicity. This isn't some theoretical risk anymore. It's a frontline emergency for clinicians.
It absolutely is. And the perspective on nitrous oxide, or N2O, has completely shifted. It was always seen as, relatively safe with temporary effects.
Right.
We now know it can cause profound, serious neurotoxicity. And the urgency is coming from this huge surge in recreational abuse.
And why are we seeing this explosion right now? What's changed?
It's the availability. It is just unprecedented. You can now buy these large cylinders online.
Not the little chargers for whipped cream.
No, I mean the big ones that hold enough gas for dozens and dozens of balloons. They're sold with minimal regulation, often disguised as legitimate products.
And the impact is hitting a specific group.
Yes, teens and young adults. The data is shocking. I mean, one state reported a 4- to 5-fold increase in related medical contacts. We're talking ER visits in just 4 years, from 2019 to 2023.
So our mission today is very clear. We need to arm you with the specific knowledge to suspect this condition, to diagnose it, and to manage it. Because if you miss N2O toxicity, you miss that critical window to intervene.
Okay, let's start with the mechanism. How does a seemingly inert gas like N2O actually, break the nervous system?
It's a fascinating mechanism, and it's entirely indirect. N2O is not a direct poison for your nerves.
So it's not killing the cells directly?
No. Instead, it goes after one specific target, vitamin B12. It causes a functional inactivation of B12, also known as cobalamin.
Functional inactivation, that's the key phrase. So how does it chemically just switch B12 off?
N2O acts as an incredibly potent oxidizing agent inside the body. Its target is the cobalt atom that sits right at the core of the B12 molecule.
For B12 to work, it has to be in its active state, which is cobalamin hide, or Co plus She. Yeah. The N2O oxidizes that atom, changing its charge. It converts it to the inactive forms, cobalamin II or cobalamin III.
So let me get this straight. If you were to run a blood test for the amount of B12, the level could look normal.
Exactly. The vitamin is physically there, but it's been chemically disabled.
It's like having a bent key.
That's a perfect analogy. It fits the lock, but it won't turn. And this immediately causes two critical B12-dependent enzymatic pathways to just fail.
All right, what are those two pathways, and what are the metabolic signals they leave behind that we can measure?
The first one to fail is the Methionine Synthase pathway. This enzyme's job is to convert homocysteine into methionine. When B12 is offline, that conversion stops cold.
And the result is?
A rapid and really steep rise in plasma homocysteine levels. Then there's a second failure. This one involves Methylmalonyl-CoA Mutase. It's supposed to process Methylmalonic Acid, or MMA, into something called succinyl-CoA.
And when that fails, you get a buildup of MMA.
It's a sharp rise in MMA levels, yes.
So we have a flood of homocysteine and MMA. What does this metabolic chaos actually do to the physical structures of the nervous system?
Well, that combination of elevated metabolites is what ultimately damages the protective myelin sheath around the nerve fibers.
The insulation.
The insulation, exactly. You get this neuronal demyelination, and that's the basis for the specific severe syndrome we call subacute combined cord degeneration, or SCCD. This is what causes the progressive failure of the sensory and motor tracts in the spinal cord.
That mechanism is so important to understand because, practically speaking, a patient is not going to walk into the clinic and say, I've been using large volumes of N2O.
Ever.
They're going to use street terms, whippets, balloons. How do we get past that to get an accurate history?
Your index of suspicion has to be incredibly high, and your history taking has to be direct but completely non-judgmental. You have to use their language.
So you ask directly about whippets?
Yes. Ask, have you used whippets, chargers, smart whip, or nose? You have to use that specific terminology. It's often the only way you'll get the history you need to even begin the workup.
Okay, let's clarify the clinical picture. What's the difference between the acute risks from, say, one session versus the chronic picture we're focused on?
So the acute effects are really short-lived. A few minutes, typically. You get the psychoactive effects, euphoria, relaxation.
Right.
The physical risks there are things like loss of coordination, falls, fainting. But the single biggest immediate danger is asphyxiation.
How does that happen?
If the gas is inhaled in an enclosed space or directly from a high-pressure tank, it displaces all the oxygen. That leads to hypoxia, and it can be fatal.
But the severe neurotoxicity we're discussing today, that comes from repeated chronic use. What does that neurological picture, that subacute myeloneuropathy, look like when it walks in the door?
It's a progressive syndrome. The patient often reports a very gradual onset of sensory and motor problems. Almost universally, the first symptoms are paresthesia or hypoesthesia, that tingling pins and needles feeling,
And where does that usually start?
primarily in the lower limbs. From there, it progresses to gait instability, significant weakness in the limbs, and in severe cases, it can lead to complete paralysis and loss of bladder or bowel control.
That gait instability is a massive red flag. A recent review of 35 patients laid out some really clear statistics on the most common findings during a neurological exam.
Yes, and that data is so helpful for a quick assessment. Paresthesia or hypoesthesia in the lower limbs was present in 100% of patients.
100%. So if they don't have that, it's probably not N2O toxicity.
A universal starting point. Next, a positive Romberg sign was seen in 96.7% of them.
Okay, a positive Romberg sign. Just to remind everyone, that's when a patient can't maintain their balance with their eyes closed. It signals a failure of proprioception. They can't feel where their feet are in space.
Absolutely. That finding alone, with this history, should be a massive clue. The other big ones were gait disorders, affecting 88.6% of patients, and the loss of the Achilles' deep tendon reflexes. Those were absent in 81.8%.
So if you have a young patient with these sensory issues, trouble walking, and diminished reflexes, you have to be thinking about N2O.
You have to. Must be at the top of your list.
Since patients might minimize or hide their use, the diagnosis really comes down to the labs, confirming that metabolic signature. We mentioned the two key metabolites. What tests do we order?
You have to rely on the surrogate serum markers. You order a serum homocysteine and a Methylmalonic Acid, or MMA.
Which one is more useful?
Well, elevated homocysteine is incredibly sensitive. It will almost always be high with recent exposure, but it's not specific. Other things can raise it.
Okay.
Elevated MMA, on the other hand, is considered more specific. It's a more direct reflection of that B12 pathway being broken. Some data even suggests MMA levels can correlate with the severity of the intoxication.
Let's go back to the B12 level itself. Since the problem is functional inactivation, not a true deficiency, what are clinicians going to see on that test?
And this is the most common pitfall. This is where people get tripped up. The serum vitamin B12 level is all over the place.
It can be low.
It can be low, which might confuse things, but critically, it can also be completely normal.
So a normal B12 level doesn't rule it out.
It absolutely does not rule out nitrous oxide toxicity. We have to stress that. If you rely only on the B12 level, you risk a catastrophic delay in diagnosis.
So you bypass the B12 level and go straight for the metabolic surrogates. Any other baseline labs we need?
Yes. You must get a complete blood count, a CBC. We're looking for evidence of megaloblastic anemia, which is when the red blood cells are abnormally large. Finding that just corroborates the whole story of B12 pathway disruption.
And what about imaging? When do you get an MRI?
Neuroimaging is a key step, especially if the patient has significant motor symptoms or that gait instability. You're looking for the classic finding on a spinal MRI. The pattern of subacute combined cord degeneration. It shows up as these characteristic hyperintensities or bright spots along the posterior columns of the spinal cord. That specific finding was seen in nearly 70%, 69.7% of patients who got an MRI in one review.
And finally, electrophysiology studies, EDX. What unique information do those give us?
These studies are essential. They help us characterize the type and extent of the nerve damage. They can tell you if you're dealing with a predominantly demyelinating neuropathy, where the myelin sheath is damaged, or an axonal pattern, where the nerve fiber itself is lost.
And that distinction is important for more than just the diagnosis.
It's critical for prognosis, for talking to the patient and their family about what recovery might look like.
Okay, let's shift to management. We have a toxic exposure and a metabolic failure. What's the two-pronged approach to treatment?
It requires two immediate non-negotiable steps.
Wow.
Step 1, absolute and permanent cessation of all nitrous oxide exposure.
That's paramount.
It is. If the patient continues to use, the neurological damage will just keep getting worse no matter what we do.
And step 2 is replacing the substrate. We have to flood the system with new active B12. What's the protocol for that?
The standard of care is aggressive, high-dose intramuscular vitamin B12. We use cyanocobalamin on a very rigorous schedule.
What does that look like?
The initial replacement is 1 milligram intramuscularly every single day for a full week.
Daily for a week?
Yes. After that, it shifts to weekly injections for a month, and then usually to monthly maintenance injections, depending on their clinical response.
That is a much more aggressive schedule than for a simple dietary deficiency. It really highlights the severity of the inactivation.
It does.
Now, let's connect this back to those electrophysiology studies. You said the EDX results are critical for prognosis. Can you break that down for us? What's the difference in recovery between demyelinating and axonal damage?
This might be the most important part of the conversation with the patient. If the EDX shows predominantly axonal loss, meaning the nerve fibers themselves are destroyed, that damage is essentially permanent.
So recovery is very limited.
Extremely limited. The patient faces a much poorer long-term prognosis. But if the EDX suggests a predominantly demyelinating pattern, the outcome is much more favorable.
Because the body can repair myelin?
Exactly. The body has the potential to remyelinate the nerve sheath once the toxic exposure stops. This means there's a much higher likelihood of significant, maybe even complete functional recovery.
So the EDX is a direct prognostic marker. But even in that best-case scenario with demyelination, is recovery quick?
It is rarely fast. It's often a protracted process, requiring months, sometimes years of rehabilitation. And we have to be clear, even with the best treatment, patients who presented with severe symptoms, especially if there's any underlying axonal damage, may never get back to their baseline.
So the final takeaway for every healthcare provider listening is this. You have to treat any young patient with progressive paresthesia and gait instability as a potential N2O case until proven otherwise.
And you have to remember that a normal serum B12 level is meaningless.
Right. You must rely on that biomarker signature of elevated homocysteine and methylmalonic acid.
Exactly. And we also have to recognize the public perception here. This stuff is marketed as harmless fun. That makes early diagnosis so challenging. Timely intervention, guided by those biomarkers and imaging, is the only shot we have at mitigating long-term irreversible neurological damage in this really vulnerable population.
So let me leave you with this thought. Given the current reality where these large N2O cylinders holding enough gas for dozens of doses are legally and cheaply available online, what public health policy shifts beyond just simple classification changes could actually restrict access and start to lower this rapidly rising neurological burden on our young adults.